First of all, I would like to thank the organizers of the conference, in particular, Professor Roger Eames, for inviting me to attend this important conference. I'm going to talk about three important issues. First, the place of Africa in the current world order, and what can Africa offer to other nations, the way forward, and finally, I will conclude with some remarks. The purpose of my paper is to examine the place of Africa and other developing countries in the world in order to show the importance of developing more inclusive ethical and epistemological foundations that are required to reconceptualize and remap our current situation and continue to the emergence of a more sustainable and inclusive world in the 21st century. The first part is the place of Africa in the current world order. When we talk about global integration and Africa's marginalization, there are two contradictory views. The first position is that globalization has positive impacts on the world. It has promoted pluralism, therefore it is very useful. The second point is global structures have increasingly marginalized third world countries in general and Africa in particular. In particular, when we look at the current situation, we'll observe inequalities in wealth, information, communications technology, and the distribution of power. So different global forums were dominated by rich countries, and poor countries, particularly third world countries, and Africa in particular, have not much voice. And in the 1980s and in the 1990s, the IMF and the World Bank and other transnational corporations have promoted a free market economy. Third world countries were advised to open their market, but unfortunately, Western countries are determined to protect their agriculture, but they advised African and other countries to open their market in the name of free market. And therefore, many African countries, particularly 2/3 of African countries, were forced to implement structural adjustment programs. But unfortunately, structural adjustment programs have negative impacts on the economies of many African countries. Among others, for instance, they led to further impoverishment, unemployment, environmental degradation, the erosion of sovereignty, deindustrialization, and so on and so forth. Therefore, instead of decreasing poverty, it has aggravated poverty in many developing countries, particularly in Africa. As a matter of fact, the debt crisis, the declining competitiveness of its raw materials in the international market, poor management, corruption, lack of political will on the part of the leaders, and the like have incapacitated Africa. And therefore, Africa is not in a very good position in the current world order. In particular, Africa is highly vulnerable to climate change. It's ill prepared to adapt and had the lowest climate resilience in the world. For instance, climate shocks hit Africa the most. Among others, 5 of the 10 worst affected countries in 2019 were found on the African continent. So in short, because of its weak economy, inherent historical biases, feeble capacities for negotiations, and deplorably low and declining share of global trade, Africa has very little influence and voice in today's global policy forums. And the second point is the role of Africa and global peace. In particular, during the superpower competition from 1947 to 1991, the two superpowers, the Soviet Union and the United States of America, thought that Africa has had essential role for their security. Nonetheless, after the end of the East-West rivalry, these superpowers, in particular the United States of America, and later on Russia distanced themselves from Africa. Although Western countries give some aid to Africa, Africa was no longer important for their security. But the September 11 situation has changed the importance of Africa in the global order. So Africa was considered as important to fight against global terrorists. And again, when you look at the relationship between Africa and the People's Republic of China, from the 1960s to 1980s and 1990s, the Chinese government supported many African countries to liberate themselves from colonial powers because of ideological similarity and the important relationships. China has supported many African countries. However, after President Deng Xiaoping took power in 1978, he decided to stop supporting third world countries. But later on, the Chinese government tried to influence many African countries, and Chinese engagement in sub-Saharan Africa has been influenced by three important factors. The first one is strategic diplomatic objectives, one Chinese policy. Because of this policy, the Chinese government needs the support of Africans, the strategic economic objectives, and the third one is commercial objectives of firms and entrepreneurs seeking new sources of profit and opportunities. So because of this, therefore, the Chinese government invested in many African countries. Today, China is the biggest investor, trade partner in Africa, particularly since the 1989, replacing the United States of America. So on the one hand, Chinese influence has positive impacts, and at the same time, it has also negative impacts. The third part of my presentation is what can Africa offer to other nations? When you look at the current situation and Western science, European science, one can say that European science was influenced by non-Western traditions, among others, Arabic numerals and Indian mathematical concepts for medical use, such as acupuncture, presently, and compass and gunpowder, Latin shell, and the like are also Chinese in origin. And in addition to this, again, Africa has also contributed a lot to world civilization. Among others, various cultural groups in Africa have developed an environmentally friendly world view from which other nations can learn a lot. And various cultural concepts such as Ubuntu, Ukama, Safu, and the like have shown the interconnectedness of human beings, non-human beings, and ecosystems. When you look at Ubuntu, Ubuntu is a South African concept, which means I am a person because of other persons. I am what I am because of what we all are. So when you look at the basic ethical principles of Ubuntu ethics, we can say that it does not endorse colonialism, totalitarian communalism, and collectivism, dishonesty, exploitation of fellow human beings, and inhuman acts such as rape, crime, robbery, discrimination, and so on and so forth. As Desmond Tutu said, Africa can give important lessons to other nations, and therefore other nations can learn a lot from Ubuntu ethics. And it's very important. According to Ubuntu ethics, when you are happy, I also feel happy. When you are in a very difficult situation, I'm determined to support you. So exploitation of fellow human beings is wrong in Ubuntu philosophy. Safu is again another important ethical principle in the Oromo of Ethiopia. The Oromo is the biggest ethnic group in Africa. In Safu, ethical principle, it would be wrong to exploit fellow human beings and at the same time overexploit even natural resources. That is very important ethical principle. So African traditions value systems provides a basis to integrate human values into the global outlook and evolving alternatives to dominant socioeconomic and technological paradigms through its communal philosophy, manifesting consensus building, social responsibility, entrepreneurship, sustainability, equity, order, reconciliation, reciprocity, fairness at all levels of human life, and so on and so forth. We can learn important lessons from African values. Among others, technological societies from both Western part and Eastern parts of the world can derive the following important lessons from African worldview. First, the importance of intra and intergenerational justice, the live and let live attitudes towards non-human beings, positive relationship to rather than violent domination of the natural environment, producing what we need rather than producing more than we need, the conservation of biodiversity for sustainability rather than biological homogenization, interconnectedness and interdependence of all life forms and the natural environment. And another important lesson is religious tolerance and short-lived memories of hatred. We have about 3 different religious traditions: Christianity, Islam, and indigenous African religions. So we can find the religious tolerance among these traditions. So that is another important lesson. The way forward. All United Nations member states should work to amend the UN Constitution to serve the interests of all nations equally. When you look at the UN system at the moment, it is undemocratic because after the end of the Second World War, the victors of the Second World War appointed themselves as the members of the Security Council, and they also allowed China to be part of this Security Council. But unfortunately, about 1.2 billion Muslims were excluded from this, and the whole continent of Africa was excluded from this, although there are some Muslims in Africa. So because of this, therefore, it gave the veto power to these members of the Security Council. So I would suggest that the vetoes should be replaced with popular representation and qualified majority voting for the UN Security Council to serve all member states equally and justly. Yesterday, one of the presenters stated that nothing can change the current world order. But I would suggest that if you don't change this, we cannot remap the current world order and will not be able to address global problems that is affecting different parts of the world. So, according to Hampshire in 1995, and what he said in 1995 is still valid. Promoting internationalism requires a change in popular thought and sentiment in the United States. And again, another American philosopher, Dennis Goulart, who is considered the father of development ethics, said that to address the current global problems, we need some kind of cultural revolution in the United States of America. Otherwise, it will be difficult to remap the current world order. And again, we need also a global network of cooperation. In particular, we need South-South cooperation, and at the same time, the cooperation of all nations. In particular, to influence the current world order, African countries should be united. So African unity is the key. As the former leader of Ghana, Kwame Nkrumah, said, Africans must unite. If they don't unite themselves, they will not be able to stand as a strong force and influence the world. And another important measure that needs to be taken is the need to establish regional economic and political groups. Africans have already established some regional economic groups. In spite of this, regional economic groups were not strong because of duplication of this regional group in different parts of the world. And again, they also imitated Western schemes. Because of this, so far, they have not had positive impacts on the economies of Africa. So African countries should boost intra-Africa trade by correcting the already existing shortcomings of regional trade initiatives to strengthen their economic development and to deal with unexpected economic shocks. And the establishment of the African Continental Free Trade Area in 2018 by the African Continental Free Trade Agreement will also help to diversify trade and develop trade networks. Currently, it will be very easy to trade with some European countries and even with North American countries rather than trading among themselves in Africa. That needs to be changed. And again, African scholars can also contribute to the solution of African problems and the remapping of the current world order. But unfortunately, some African leaders do not encourage African leaders to contribute to this solution. Therefore, African leaders should try to support African scholars to address this problem. And in addition to this, we also need public participation. And finally, an ethically guided global dialogue of different civilizations will help us to build a more civilized and a more just world for human and non-human beings. So that's very important. Therefore, different civilizations should come together and try to address different global problems on equal basis. But as usual, power is not willing to listen to ethics. And some powerful countries are not willing to listen to weak countries. That needs to be changed. And if we don't do this, the world will be in a very difficult situation. Having said that, I will briefly conclude my presentation. First, the reconceptualization and remapping of the current world order require the development of more inclusive ethical and epistemological foundations that can lead to a just and peaceful world in the 21st century. Changing the Eurocentric conceptual framework of hegemony can help us understand the current cultures and practices of different empirical intellectual traditions. Second, indigenous voices are important to understand global realities and to remap the world in a way that makes sense to us. Thus, marginalized African voices and the majority of the world's population should participate in such a remapping and influence local, national, and international development and international agendas. Third, African and non-African scholars should support marginalized groups to be heard at different levels. In particular, I would like to encourage Western scholars to try to question the dominant discourses and to listen to very hard to the African voices that offer counter discourses. They can influence their governments, and they can also raise public awareness in the respective countries that will help, therefore, the public to influence their leaders. Therefore, the leaders can be forced to address these global issues. And fourth, all countries should contribute to world peace and human development, and the world should be governed by just laws rather than by the assertion of raw military power. One country should not be given absolute power to dominate the world and to promote its own vested interest at the expense of the interest of the majority of the people. And finally, we need fundamental change in the structures of global power, where weak countries are no longer weak and powerful countries are no longer powerful, and therefore they should come together and try to address global issues together. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Professor Kelbessa. Any questions and comments? Yeah, Professor Baogang.
Yes, hi, Professor. Thank you for your remarkable summary on Africa. I was struck by your one idea that during Cold War, in the wake of the Cold War, Africa loses strategic significance from both United States and the Soviet Union. Now, currently, the increased strategic competition between United States and China certainly help to significantly increase Africa's strategic position now. Many African countries can benefit from this competition. My question to you is that in your talk, you mentioned Africa's voice has been marginalized. And I wonder what's your view about the Chinese government claim that their idea of rights to development represent Africa's views. So they claim their promotion of rights to development is representative, in particular in South Africa, in Asia, in Latin America. So I would like to have your personal evaluation about Chinese officials, this claim. Is this claim dubious? Yeah, is this claim does have some empirical support?
Thank you very much for this excellent question. As I've said earlier, we can talk about the historical relationship between China and the African continent from ancient times. And in particular, as I said, during African struggle for liberation to liberate themselves from colonial powers, the Chinese government supported many African countries. But later on, as I said earlier on, particularly since 1978, the Chinese government changed its policy. And the Chinese government also decided to promote a kind of free market economy. And therefore, China imports different minerals, including oil from the African continent. And when we look at the relationship between Africa and China, the Chinese government officially stated that the relationship between Africa and China is based on equality. So we are not trying to promote our vested interest at the expense of African interest. We are benefiting from Africa, and Africans are also benefiting from the Chinese investment and other related things. So, and again, there are two different views here. According to some writers, the Chinese government usually invested where, in some countries where the democratic practice is very low, very weak. And because of this, some said the Chinese government simply exploited the African government and many African countries. And because of this, therefore, they are trying to replace the Western powers. And because of this, they are not really helping Africa. And the second position is that this is not really correct, although the Chinese government invested in poor countries where democracy is very weak. They are also investing in other countries, even including in South Africa and other countries where democracy is a kind of strong. So because of this, the impact of China on the African economy is largely positive. And personally, I also share this point because, as I said, currently, China is the largest investor in the African continent. China also helped some countries to remove African debt. And they also give scholarship for many African students. And they participated in the investment of infrastructure and other issues. So because of this, some said the Chinese government use non-interference policy partly because of this, it has had positive impacts on Africa. But again, according to some others, the Chinese government also supported some dictators in African countries because of its policy, non-interference policy. China doesn't care about democracy. Because of this, some said it has had negative impact on many African countries. But in spite of this, generally speaking, I think that the Chinese government has had positive impacts on the African continent. That is what I would like to emphasize here.
安老师。
Thank you, Peng Lao Shi. Workineh, I really think that the China-Africa relationship is hugely important. I mean, the pre-1978, it was about decolonization, but the post-1978 and the fact that China is the greatest investor in Africa, the mixed successes of China, the Chinese-African relationship, I think is so important. Like what we know is that in 2013, China introduced this Belt and Road Initiative. And the Belt and Road Initiative needs a standard in order to measure successes and failures. And the Chinese experience in Africa can really provide that. That would be the one point. The second point would be that the real challenge in this Belt and Road Initiative for China is China was successful in developing itself economically and politically because of its culture. When China wants to pursue the Belt and Road Initiative, what is missing in its engagement with other countries is the cultural factor. And so something like Ubuntu, you know, where in the Confucian tradition, you can, if there's only one person, there are no persons. That persons can only become persons through other persons. That the quality of a person is a function of the cultivation of their relationships with other people, the ecological sensibilities of Ubuntu. And so one of the things that Africa gives us is a very simple fact, and that is that maybe 20% of the world's population is committed to some kind of liberalism, but most of the world has cultural values that are more resonant with a Confucian tradition than they are with a liberal Europe or a liberal America. And so I think that China and the African relationship, understanding each other better and benefiting from that understanding is so vital.
Thank you very much, Professor Roger. Yes, I completely agree with you. And just for information, I also published an article on African and Confucian environmental ethics. African environmental ethics and Confucian environmental ethics share many things in common. Therefore, they can learn a lot from each other. And as you said, particularly Ubuntu ethics. As you said, Ubuntu ethics is very important. And I am a person because of other persons. Ubuntu ethics does not really emphasize competition, although it does not reject competition. The point is, when your neighbors are in a very difficult situation and spending the night with empty stomach, you have to give what you have to support your neighbors. But if you simply promote your own interest and ignore people who need support, you are losing Ubuntu. You are therefore violating Ubuntu ethics. Similarly, in Oromo environmental philosophy, as I said earlier on, when somebody is in a very difficult situation, Oromo ethics also said that we are required to support those individuals who are in need. Therefore, each individual is required to give his own fair share. Even sometimes if an individual fails to do so, the community will force this individual to pay his own fair share to support individuals who are in a very difficult situation. Either they can support them in kind of cash or in kind. So Ubuntu ethics is very, very important. And at the same time, as I said, Oromo environmental ethics is also very important. And as we said, in 2013, the Chinese government decided to promote the Belt and Road Initiative. And again, when we look at the Chinese investment in Africa, as I said earlier on, in one way or another, it has had negative impacts because the environmental records of some Chinese government corporations and even international corporations do not pay sufficient attention to environmental well-being. So sometimes, therefore, they externalize environmental and social cost. So that is one negative impact of Chinese investment on the African continent. And secondly, most of the time, African governments import cheap Chinese products. Those cheap Chinese products, therefore, have had again negative impact on indigenous technologies in the African continent. But generally speaking, as I said, although the Chinese investment has had positive impacts, it has also negative impacts. Therefore, Chinese corporations are required to internalize environmental and at the same time social impacts. If they try to do so, therefore, at the end of the day, their impact will be positive, and Africa will benefit much from the Chinese investment, and the Chinese government and the Chinese people can also benefit from different African countries, and they can also learn important lessons, as you said, from African traditions. Thank you very much for your comments.
Professor Wang Hui, now we have the last question. Yeah.
Yes, thank you. I know that we all already use up the time, so I try to put questions very short. And I enjoy the talk. What I want to ask about the chat, you basically you argue that after the end of the 70s, Africa was more or less compared to the early period, even more marginalized. That some the observers and analysts argue that from the 1980s to 2010, that was basically time of the neoliberal globalization, was the period of without the non-aligned movement and the Bandung Conference. So that's the basically before the national liberation movement, the non-aligned movements, and so on and so forth, strengthen the power of the African countries through the solidarity there. So are there any alternatives for the African countries to form a new kind of the solidarity? What kind of the form of that in the post-Bandung era?
Oh, thank you very much again for this excellent question. As I've said earlier, when African countries remain divided, they cannot voice or try to promote their interests. Therefore, what is very important is they need to organize themselves and they need to make unity. Unity is very important. If they are not united, they cannot address their position in a global forum. And because of this, therefore, what is important is they have to, in the first place, they have to promote interrelationship between themselves. And again, as I said earlier on, they should also cooperate with other nations, including the so-called developing countries. If they try to cooperate with developing nations, therefore they come together and they can promote their own interest. And again, they should also try to address the concerns of their own people. But most of the time, the problem is some leaders of African countries associate themselves with some powerful countries and try to invite some powerful countries to, among others, for example, to import dirty industries and in e-waste, because in the so-called developed countries, it will be very expensive to deal with e-waste and dirty industries. Because of this, therefore, they bribe some leaders of Africa and they try to, therefore, import these dirty industries and industrial waste, e-waste. So therefore, the African people should protest against this position, and they have to cooperate with other nations, particularly the South-South cooperation is very, very important. And as I said earlier on, what we need is, we need international cooperation. We need global dialogue among nations. If we don't, therefore, promote this, it will be very difficult to address the current global problems. And even the so-called developed countries will be in a very difficult situation to address global issues. Among others, for example, they are paying the price in relation to climate change. Therefore, on the one hand, South-South cooperation is very important. And again, global dialogue between developing and developed countries is very, very important. If they don't promote this, the world cannot address global problems, and we cannot really solve the current global problems. So what we need is global dialogue, which is based on ethical principles, which is willing to listen to different voices. If they promote this, therefore, I hope that the world will be able to address some of the problems we're facing today. Thank you very much.